Hello, and thank you for watching this webcast. I'd like to begin with a little bit of a disclosure statement. I'm presenting this on behalf of Hydro-Dyne Engineering, a Clearwater, Florida-based supplier of screens, screening handling, and grit removal equipment. We also take a great deal of pride in our in-house engineering and manufacturing, as well as some controls that we've put in place over our supply chain. In fact, several years ago, we focused on as many domestic source products and materials as we could for various cost, availability, and quality reasons. So much so that we started saying, Build America, Buy America is just business as usual at Hydro-Dyne. So while we are confident that we won't have any problems meeting any of the domestic content requirements of this legislation, we have been following it very closely, knowing the implications for us, as well as all suppliers in our industry. To that end, I wanted to share what we've learned in hopes that it will inform and better position you for success in navigating something that currently will impact basically all U.S. municipal water sector projects that receive any federal funding. I'd also like to note that the information in this video is current as of May 12th, 2022. A lot is happening as some critical dates are approaching, so please visit our website for the most current information. In fact, a portion of our website is dedicated to this topic with various links to a number of sources, and we'll provide those at the end of this presentation. Now I'll go through an overview, a bit of background on the law and enforcement requirements, compliance, guidance, waivers, some equipment considerations, as well as some next steps. In a bit of the overview of the law, it should be noted that $1.2 trillion was awarded for the physical infrastructure bill, paving the way for enactment of really a major component of President Biden's Build Back Better domestic infrastructure agenda. This included $55 billion, maybe a little bit more, for water sector, and this was noted multiple times as being a generational amount of money or transformational, and it truly is the most that's ever been earmarked for the water sector and should provide some of the most transformational improvements in our water sector since the Clean Water Act and CERCLA in the 70s and 80s. There are a bunch of names for this law or bill as it's come out, so you'll see a number of acronyms including IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, BID, which is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Deal, BIL, which is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and this is the actual public law that seems to be gaining the most traction as the common acronym. But the reality is it is a law, and it was signed in effect on November 15, 2021, and it goes into effect 180 days after that date. So May 14th is the date in which this will go into effect. And a lot of the mention on it being bipartisan is a function of about 13 members of the Republicans in the House voted for it, and all but 6 Democrats voted against it. So in these days and ages, that's about as bipartisan as I guess we'll get. Included in the law is some fairly extensive and explicit language on BABA, which is Build America, Buy America Act. So it is great that we have this massive infrastructure spending and bill, but there are some fairly significant strings attached to it. BABA states that it is the domestic content procurement preference policies that now apply to all federal procured and various federal aid infrastructure programs, including non-federal projects. This includes, but is not limited to, the Clean Water SRF, Drinking Water SRF, WIFIA, all other EPA grants, loans, and pilot projects funded with federal dollars, including USDA Rural Utility Service and U.S. Army Corps of Engineer projects. Some more on the overview included some recent guidelines that clarified that the renewal awards and amendments obligating additional funds to existing awards that are executed on or before May 14, 2022 must also include Buy America preference language. This means that agencies must include a Buy America preference in awards issued on or after May 14th, even if notices of funding opportunities for those awards did not include a Buy America preference. I should note that BABA only applies to equivalency projects utilizing federal funds going forward. So past projects that were awarded, this will not apply to. Previously funded projects or revolving funds would not need to comply unless new federal funds are mixed in. So if new federal funds come into the same SRF account that had old funds in it, basically those funds would now be mixed, and the guidance that we've been given is now that whole fund would need to apply. So new projects coming out of that, even if there is old money or revolving fund money in there, all have to comply with BABA. So what are the intentions of BABA? It's been relayed that the goal is to promote domestic manufacturing by creating, growing, and bringing back or reshoring products. And reshoring manufacturing is a bit of a touchy term because some products may not have ever been made here. So it's bringing onshore or reshoring stuff that used to be made in the United States, as well as hoping to provide more domestic manufacturing of products that traditionally have not. And the intent of all this is to make domestic supply chains more resilient. And an overriding edict that the EPA and OMB have given is saying that this also has to happen on time, on task, and on budget. Diving more into the background of Buy America or Buy American relevant to domestic content. So Buy America, Buy American has been around for a long time. There's been multiple rounds and variations of this going back to the 1930s. Some of the more recent Buy America legislation that we have seen has been through ARRA, the American Resource and Recovery Act in 2009. With regards to the Buy American language within ARRA, though, most of it was largely exempt for the water sector because it listed federal friendly trading partner countries. So products coming out of certain countries were exempt. And we also had a lot of language regarding substantial transformation. So if it came over in the United States and was some assemblies were bolted together, that could be classified as being substantially transformed and would be exempt from the Buy America requirements under ARRA. Next in our industry, we saw AIS. This was introduced in 2014, and by 2021, it was really through most of the water sector as a permanent Buy America requirement. Manufactured goods under AIS were largely exempted. There were some very broad waivers that included electromechanical equipment, so most things with a motor or electrical controls were excluded from those requirements. And then further exemptions were provided naming off specific types of equipment that would be left out of the Buy America requirements in there, but it still held true for a lot of iron and steel that was required to be manufactured in the United States. And then of course more recently, we're all talking about this subject matter through the BIL infrastructure law that has come through with the BABA language, which has become a lot more common within our industry and what we're talking about in this webinar, because some obvious efforts have been made to close some of the loopholes and exemptions that were provided in recent rounds. BABA is different than what we have seen in the past. In contrast to Buy America and ARRA, BABA statutorily directs federal funds for domestic preference on all future infrastructure projects resulting in an enduring and permanent impact. And the goal of this again is to make domestic supply chains more resilient, and BABA would effectively bar federal financial assistance for infrastructure unless domestic content requirements are met. And by making BABA a statute within this law, it does not have a close date or a sundown at the end of this round of infrastructure funding. So basically, it will continue to apply to all future federal infrastructure spending, and it would require another law to end it. So when we're looking at the enforcement and really the administration of BABA, we have two agencies, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. The OMB provides guidance and reviews waivers. Under the BIL, a director of Made in America was established. So we have a director of Made in America office, and the director of that office is Celeste Drake. We also have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Their role in this is to advise the OMB on waiver needs and implement and enforce the law. And the EPA, I believe, also is who will be issuing waivers as they do come out. And this will be handled in the EPA headquarters under the Assistant Administrator, Radhika Fox. And there are about 8 people within that office that will be overlooking all of these waivers. So they're going to be fairly busy coming up, working through this process and administering it. Some of the additional requirements for this, the guidance that we've received recently, I think has smartly said you can only fall into one category. So an article, material, or supply should only be classified into one of the following categories. We have iron and steel, a manufactured product, or construction material. And construction materials are very similar to what we saw under AIS with iron and steel, but we've added to that some new to AIS requirements with non-ferrous metals, plastic and polymer-based products, and this includes PVC, as well as glass, drywall, and lumber. So looking at the easy ones on this list, the first and third one, all iron and steel has to be made in the United States, and with the iron it includes all manufacturing processes from the initial melting stage through application of coatings, and all of this must occur in the United States. And construction materials have the same sort of requirements with it having to be, all of it having to be made in the United States, but it's up for debate a little bit on some products that may fall as a construction material, or they might be better classified as a manufactured product. The manufactured products is going into a bit more detail and certainly the focus of this webinar. And it's defining all manufactured products used in a project are to be produced in the United States. And so what does this mean? Well, as stated in section 70912 definitions 6, produced in the United States states that the manufactured product was manufactured in the United States and the cost of the components of the manufactured product are mined, produced, or manufactured in the United States is greater than 55% of the total cost of all of the components of the manufactured product. And so I'll let that sink in a little bit, as that really is the crux of this whole matter. Goods, products, systems all have to be manufactured in the US, and 55% of the costs of the materials or components in those products has to be from the United States. And when we're looking at compliance, we expect some certifications that a manufacturer will be required to supply, either a compliance letter or a certification after the project's done. This certification letter is likely going to look like AIS requirements. They haven't come out and defined exactly what this will look like, but we expect it to follow suit. And so under AIS, there were 5 key elements that had to be in a certification. You had to have the delivery jurisdiction, so basically in the letter it had to define where the product was being delivered to, or the name of the project, the product that was being manufactured and delivered, the manufacturer's location, and if there are multiple manufacturers, multiple locations of where it was made, signature by the company representative or an officer, and then of course the reference to the requirement. So under AIS it was to the ARS requirement. Under BABA it will be under the 55% domestic content slide that I just read off a second ago. So when we're looking at the cost calculations for this, it's going to be pretty tricky as it comes out, and a lot of clarifications are going to be needed on how these cost calculations are done. One thing that the OMB has been very clear on, though, is that labor from a supplier is not included. They've reiterated this a few times, and the EPA has backed that up. So basically, a supplier to a manufacturer's labor as a part of their cost would be included in the supplier's cost, but a manufacturer's labor does not currently count. So this is a big item that a lot of people are discussing and even contending to. I think this will be something that we will see probably given some guidance and might even get clarified or changed. It's kind of hard to imagine a domestic in-house manufacturer being quote unquote penalized for manufacturing their own good when they could claim the labor on that if they were subcontracting out the manufacturing to another company down the street from them. The challenge that we realize in that though is it'll be really hard to pin a number and a dollar amount as a percentage of the overall costs to internal labors. And the language within the law goes into waivers and clarifies that a little bit and even draws out specific items that would not be included as labor, like engineering. But we'll probably see some clarification on this come out and might even see a percentage attached to the costs that could be in-house labor. And I think that will probably come out fairly soon because it's what a lot of the questions are centered around. Also, one of the things that's not clear in how these costs are to be calculated is if an item as a component of a system is given a waiver because that product is not available or for some other reason was excluded, how would the cost of that component impact the overall percentages within the product or the system? So would it be removed completely and you start with a new baseline cost, or would it be included as a domestic percentage that would go towards domestic compliance? We're just not clear on that and haven't been given some answers to how that would be calculated. We are starting to receive some guidance. So from the time the law was passed in November through early this year, we were told guidance is coming, and we eventually got some. So the first official bit was released on April 18th. A lot of this guidance largely cited areas of the law and really just clarified some dates and some funding sources. What is pretty clear though is that while the law is clean and stated of what will have to comply, it's hard to imagine this being implemented really with any hopes of sticking to the on time, on task, on budget edict, particularly on big projects that are going to include a lot of different products and systems. Therefore, we've got a lot of manufacturers asking lots of questions, and it's generally answered with guidance is coming, and then we're looking for that guidance to come out, but dates are closing in on us pretty rapidly now. And this guidance is coming from the OMB to federal agencies like the EPA or DOT, and in our industry, of course, the EPA is who we're looking to. So as the EPA and the OMB are releasing this guidance, they do continue to stress that BABA is new and it's going to be the permanent law of the land, meaning it's here to stay. All future monies are intended to comply with this. They've also made it clear that a product is a system. So basically anything sold by a manufacturer, as they say, under normal course of business, so that would include bolts and fittings and anything that's in the box or in the container going to the project, that whole system equals a product. So that is the domestic good or domestic product that needs to comply. And I think the guidance has been pretty clear on that. So if we're talking about a pump skid with a bunch of components, or in our world, a screen with a compactor and controls, all of that is going to equal a manufactured product. And the language within BABA has really gone to pretty extensive lengths to get around the loopholes that we saw with ARRA with regards to substantial transformation. So we're not expecting there to be an allowance for stuff that's bolted together in the United States that either could be made here or could have been bolted together somewhere else. That would still count as a foreign good. So what is this doing? This is sparking a lot of talks about waivers. So if someone can't comply, really the only avenue to work through these federal funded projects is to get a waiver exempting that good or product or the whole project. So there's a lot to go through on the waiver aspect of things. The OMB website is to be set up by November 15th of 2022. Until then, though, we will be using the AIS website, which is on the EPA's website, and we'll provide a link to that because that's what we're going to be using in the meantime. It's important to note that manufacturers or consulting engineers cannot apply for a waiver. They can only comment on this. The only people who can apply for it are the utilities, so the municipalities or authorities that are actually receiving the funding. That's who can apply for the waiver. And there are different categories, there are different principles and different types. And so there's a whole lot of items that have to be included in a waiver submission. I'm not going to read those. There's 15 or 20 different items and pieces of information that have to be included. But what I will focus on for this webinar is the categories, the principles, and the types of waivers. The different categories of waivers, there's only two. We have project-specific waivers, which will have a 15-day public comment period. And then we have general applicability or national waivers, and those will have a 30-day public comment period. And these have to be renewed every 5 years. So guidance so far from the EPA has been pretty clear that this is going to start off with project-specific waivers. And then after a few similar project-specific waivers are reviewed and perhaps granted, that's when they'll start to consider national waivers. It'll be interesting to see how this unfolds because we've already seen some language coming out asking for review and comments on different potential waivers that may come out. What the EPA has and the OMB has repeatedly and regularly stressed is that waivers will be judiciously awarded, and that is actually in the law as it came out. So they've stated that they're really not planning on handing out the big broad waivers like we saw under ARA and AIS. Again, we'll see how all this unfolds though. The waiver principles. So the principles are basically guidelines for issuing the waivers. And we have three different principles that we're looking at. The first, they must be project or project award specific and time limited with an expiration date. And the time frames that we've been given vary a bit, very short-term ones, 6 months maybe, up to maybe longer term would be more like 2 years, but it's a fairly short time frame in the world of the length of our projects. The second one is that waivers must be targeted and not more inclusive than needed. And the EPA has said that broad waivers are going to receive greater scrutiny than narrow waivers, trying to encourage as these waivers come through to be pretty specific and either focus in on certainly a single project, if not products on that project. And then the third is that they must be conditional. And by conditional, the EPA has said that they've been encouraged to issue waivers with conditions that support BABA. And lastly, our types of waivers. We have three types of waivers that are going to be allowed. We have non-availability waivers. We have unreasonable cost waivers, and unreasonable cost means that the overall project, so including construction, engineering, equipment, installation, everything, the whole project has to increase by more than 25% for an unreasonable cost waiver to apply. And then the third type is public interest waivers. And there are a lot of examples of public interest waivers. We have de minimis standards, small grants, minor components, urgent matters, the adjustment period waivers, and then other considerations, which is kind of like a miscellaneous catch-all of maybe what else wasn't listed under public interest waivers. So kind of breaking out the crystal ball a little bit and trying my best to predict what kind of waivers we'll see. I'll start with some safe bets because these are some things that the EPA has mentioned a bit off the record but still broadcast publicly in some of their listening sessions. Two that they have thrown out is the potential for some small project or small award thresholds, so projects under a certain dollar amount, maybe that would get a waiver. And then program priority waivers. The EPA said that they might examine other program level waivers as a way to kind of ease into this. Looking a little bit deeper into that crystal ball, some of the possible waivers, and I'll list them as industry rumors because I don't think these have really been, certainly not on record, backed by anyone at the OMB or EPA, but certainly things that we've heard other manufacturers talking about that we might see come out would be some sort of a possible adjustment period or a national waiver under public interest that I mentioned that might buy a little bit more time for compliance. For SRF funding, if a project has already been submitted with their plans and specs to the state, it seems likely that that may receive a waiver because that would be pretty far along. WIFIA actually has a posting on the EPA's website right now looking for comments on a waiver that they're considering. Public interest waivers could cover issues with quality domestic product being unavailable or the municipal standardization around a product. So if a plant had 10 of a certain type of product and needed to get 2 more, there's the thinking that they may get a waiver on getting those 2 more just to keep standards within the municipality so maintenance staff know how to operate all of them instead of having to learn 2 new products. I think odds are pretty good that there will be some sort of a de minimis waiver on projects. We've seen this with AIS and I think through ARA as well, but this would be like earmarking 5% of the cost of a project to a de minimis waiver. This isn't meant to be going out and buying capital equipment or anything like that. This is more for getting like nails or plywood or something from Home Depot, just little stuff to get the project through and done. And the EPA has said that they will be looking for short-term waivers on certain products. And so we've certainly heard a number of other manufacturers that we work with that are being pretty vocal on certain products that are out there. So certain types of maybe motors or electrical components that aren't available from a domestic supply, some resins or media, that sort of thing. I'm sure a lot of these manufacturers and suppliers are making their case to the EPA, but so far the EPA has been pretty reluctant in saying who's getting what. They just made it clear that they're going to be judicious in issuing waivers. So some of the considerations that I think need to happen when we're working on specifying equipment for a project or designs. And first and foremost, we've got to look at the contract and check where what the funding requirements are. Is it AIS compliance, BABA? It could be both. I think we will probably see instances when it's both. We have heard a few times of contracts that have been out that have had these requirements, and that's kind of shocked the EPA because they felt like past projects shouldn't have to comply, and yet we were seeing early this year projects with BABA requirements in it in January of 2022. So it's just some confusion around that. Secondly, I think we'll probably need to be looking at the position of different product manufacturers. And I really think this is going to boil down to 2 main categories. We'll see products in a space where no one can comply. And I think that's likely to see, at the very least, short-term waivers if no suppliers of a certain type of product will be able to comply with domestic content. Those short-term waivers might get extended a few times. I think that just kind of depends on if a manufacturer does start up in the United States or if one of the current manufacturers starts manufacturing domestically for compliance. And the second one is going to be where products where one or more manufacturers can comply. And I think this certainly will be the area of the biggest contention. If the EPA sticks to product-specific waivers, those who can meet the law like the way it is right now, and those who can't are left hoping for either long-term waivers or scrambling to find some means of domestic completion and supply. So I'll focus a little bit on the second example, in which case we're I think a good example of a company who can comply. We're very confident that we'll be able to comply regardless of the cost methodology of will our labor count, will it not, just because of where we source our materials. What we expect to be providing, and we're already being asked for this now, are letters expressing our abilities to comply, and then after the projects are completed, certifications for compliance. And we're seeing these requests for letters going into the design of projects, as well as a lot more requests for inputs on those designs as kind of a safe bet. So I think we'll see projects that are going to be designed around manufacturers that are confident will comply, and then likely leaving to either contractors or perhaps manufacturers to determine whether or not they can comply as or equal or other named manufacturers. I think what we'll be seeing with these letters for certification will also be requirements of material certs and perhaps even invoices from subcontractors. And those are things that I know we are, and I think other manufacturers are already starting to get letters of compliance from our subcomponent manufacturers, just so that when we are asked for it, we'll have that stuff ready and available to prove that we can meet it. And I think the last one that we'll probably see is some cost variations and options for compliance. So certain products that are in the market will probably have a compliant product and then a non-compliant product. And we saw this under AIS with different types of pipes and fittings and valves, where there would be a AIS compliant option and then a non-compliant option depending on funding of a project or if it was going private or municipal. And I think we'll probably see some of that in the water sector space to continue under BABA. And so what are some of the next steps that we see coming on this? To throw another acronym at everyone, we have FAR, which is the Federal Acquisition Regulation. This is going to be for federal projects where they're proposing right now going from 55% to 75% domestic content requirement, stepped up over the next 5 years. It should be clear to note this does not apply really to many infrastructure products or any infrastructure projects now, but the thinking is that some of those infrastructure projects may follow this because it is federal funds, and federal funds are what are feeding some of the water and wastewater sector projects that we're seeing now. But right now, this is really just talking about applying to federal projects, which would be like Department of Defense or NASA or something like that. We're definitely seeing a lot of confusion in our space right now. Probably if you're watching this, there's a little bit on your end, and hopefully we're clarifying that a little bit. We are already seeing projects that are coming out with these requirements in them now. And as I mentioned, the EPA was kind of astounded to hear that a couple weeks ago when we were telling them as early as January of 2022 that we were seeing projects with BABA requirements in it. And they really didn't understand how that could be the case. And I think it was really a function of municipalities wanting to make sure they were out in front of this. And as I mentioned, kind of trickling down the responsibility to comply to contractors or manufacturers and making sure that they were safe and that their funding wouldn't be messed up if they had non-compliant suppliers on there. We do expect to see a waiver website. The OMB one will be up late this year in November. EPA through AIS has it up now. We can give you a link to that. There's some emails that comments can go to on potential waivers, the need for, or maybe the not need for those waivers to go out. We do expect guidance on both WIFIA and SRF. In fact, the EPA just released a WIFIA, they called it a pre-decisional draft earlier this week of a program waiver for comments that should go out. We can expect something along those lines with SRF fairly soon, I think. We also expect some guidance when it comes to price and cost. So price from a supplier, from a manufacturer to a supplier mean different things. As a manufacturer, when we buy something, that's our cost, but to the people we buy it from, it's their price. How will these costs be included with regards to in-house labor? Not real sure. Also, how will products with waivers figure into those calculations? So if something is waived, will it count towards, against, or just be removed from domestic content? And then lastly, I think the bond market's going to play a big role in all of this. Last year, looking at some rates on SRF projects relative to the bond market, it was about 1.5% more expensive to borrow money from Wall Street, but it's certainly not unlike Wall Street, to avoid an opportunity. So I expect bonds to play a larger role in considerations for funding of projects, particularly on larger jobs, because some of these requirements, it may make a better deal to go for a bond, or it still may make a lot of sense to go after the federal funding. And so I'll wrap this up by thanking everyone for listening today. I certainly do appreciate your time. I'll also take a moment for a bit of a shameless plug to visit our website. We do have a page dedicated to this topic with a lot of links that are, as well as downloads regarding the law, the waiver websites, the emails that you can send comments to, recent guidance that's come out after this is recorded, future recent guidance, and any new information that we come out, as well as some other videos that I expect we will be making. And I'd certainly like to welcome emails or calls from anyone attending. If you have some questions or comments on this, happy to hear, and hopefully we can be a source of information to help navigate this, as I said earlier, to the success of everyone attending. So thank you again, and I'd like to wish you a great rest of your day.